Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I know we have a few more people joining, so I will talk slow. Welcome, I'm Tamara Ecker, Managing Director of British American Business. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's program, just one day shy of the start of Pride Month. And today we're here to discuss, identify challenges organizations face in creating an LGBTQ plus inclusive workplace, as well as the reciprocal solutions to mold a more inclusive culture at work. We'll also discuss the LGBTQ plus inclusion agenda from a global perspective, as well as trans community inclusion and support. Before we jump into all of that, I would like to take the opportunity to remind everyone that this event is part of BAB's STIR series discussing diversity, equity, and inclusion against a backdrop of US-UK business. It's a series built in partnership with our members to address these cross-cutting issues regardless of sector, geography, or company size. This program is made possible with thanks in large part to our annual STIR sponsors, who are ACCA, Broadridge, EY, Fitch Ratings, and National Grid. To help us tackle today's topic and lead us through the discussion, we are very lucky to be joined by Catherine Nuke-Freeman, co-founder, president, and chief culture officer for Shift HR Compliance Training. I'm going to hand over to Catherine now, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about herself and her panelists today.
Thanks, Tamara. I am so happy to be here today, and I love seeing so many names on the RSVP list. It's clear that not only the panelists today are incredibly passionate and dedicated to this subject, but we have so many engaged attendees as well. As you mentioned, I'm co-founder of Shift HR Compliance Training. And that really came to be because I'm an employment lawyer by training, and I also co-founded and co-run the largest woman-owned employment law firm on the East Coast, just outside of New York City and in New York City. And one of the things we do is do a lot of instructor-led training on topics like what we're talking about today, LGBTQ and other really essential DEI issues. And that's really how Shift came about for organizations who have thousands or tens of thousands of employees. So I'm a passionate advocate and a passionate constant learner in this area, as are our panelists. We have a very esteemed group of panelists. And before I get to their introductions, I'll just quickly give you what I've been told are the house rules for this call. To get everyone on the same page, please know that we've got about 40 minutes of discussion amongst the panelists, during which time we absolutely welcome you to use the raise hand function on Zoom so that we know if you have questions as we go, and we'll intersperse them. Of course, we are going to have Q&A after that 40 minutes. If you want to save your questions, you're welcome to do that too. And all the panelists will engage and respond as we go. We ask that if you're not speaking, that you just keep yourselves on mute so that there's no distraction. And we also want to let you know that the session is being recorded. So please just make sure to acknowledge that so you can continue on with us. What I'll do is I'll give you the list of the three panelists, and then I'll give each panelist an opportunity to introduce themselves, starting with, we have AJ Brown from Bain & Company. He is a partner there. We have Anthony Maroney, who's global co-chair of SC Pride at Standard Chartered. And we have Brittany Knowles-Torres, who's a shareholder at Littler. And AJ, why don't we start with you if you'd like to give the group an introduction, and then we'll move on to Anthony and then to Brittany.
Yes, happy to. Good morning, everyone. AJ Brown. I am a partner at Bain & Company in our DC office. I spend most of my time in our M&A practice, but relevant to the call today, I am our local office DE&I champion, as well as our America's lead for Be Glad, which is our LGBTQ plus ERG or affinity group. So spend a lot of my time thinking about inclusion, advocating on behalf and supporting our queer colleagues across North American offices, but also in support of that globally. So looking forward to speaking to you all today.
Great. Thanks, AJ. Anthony, would you like to take it from there?
Thank you, Catherine. So I am the regional head of property for US and the Americas and the regional head of asset management for the bank. But my gay job is the global co-chair of our SC Pride ERG. And I was the founder of that as well within the bank. So spend a lot of time looking after our very complex organization. So we operate in 59 markets, the majority of which are emerging markets, which creates a very difficult and unique footprint for us as an organization in navigating LGBTQIA plus intersectional. So really excited to be a part of the panel today, and thank you.
Great, thanks, Anthony. And Brittany, you can bat clean up.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I am a shareholder with Littler Mendelson, and like Catherine, I focus on employment law. Specifically, I'm an innovation and equity focused advisor and litigator. And so a big part of my practice does relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion and the way that that is evolving, especially in recent years. Before, my practice was heavily focused in DEI, and actually before clients were actually seeking legal advice on this topic, I was a member of our firm's Diversity and Inclusion Council. So previously having a formal advocacy role, now more having an advice role for various clients. And so I'm going to focus on the advice side of things today and just fill out the picture with the legal questions that are coming through on related topics.
That's great. It's nice to have so many different perspectives on the call. So we'll just do a round robin response. And again, our goal today is for everybody on the call to walk away with some additional ideas, some additional strategies, perhaps some additional follow-up questions for our panelists. And let's kick it off with this first question. I'm sure for most of us, the first time when applicants and pre-employees have an opportunity to be exposed to our organizations is through the recruitment process. So that said, what are some inclusive practices, processes that we can build into our organization to really show the commitment we have to these LGBTQ plus and other DEI goals? Does anybody want to kick that one off? Anthony, you're smiling. Do you want to start with a...
Yeah, very happy to. I mean, obviously, Brittany's probably going to have a far more informed opinion than I will, just because of the recruitment process being so heavily regulated. But one of the things that we've noticed within, our bank's processes and how we onboard staff, one is just being very intentional. So the first piece is taking a look at your job requisitions. There's some very easy free tooling out there to check your job requisitions to make sure that what you're posting is gender neutral, that it is inclusive language built into that job requisition. For those who think this needs to be something that is costly, you can look at Microsoft tools. Most of them have this actually built in as a platform where you can run your job requisitions through and validate whether or not they're at a language level inclusive. Also pause and think a lot. And one of the areas when you think about historically marginalized communities, including the LGBTQIA plus community, think about the way in which you're creating requirements in a job requisition. What is truly required as a skill set versus what is a lift and shift of the prior incumbent in that role? If we think historically, obviously there is a very specific demographic that we are going to be targeting if we keep everything the way it's always been. So really do think about what job requirements and skill sets look like and how you could be eliminating really qualified candidates by being overly restrictive in those requirements.
Love it. So true. Brittany, do you want to weigh in on that as well?
Absolutely. I agree completely with Anthony's comments. Spot on. In being intentional is usually the headline of what I'm talking about with clients. I think of two buckets. First would be externally, what are you actually putting out there for the purposes of recruitment and making sure that the message is consistent with intention, making sure the EEO sort of policy foundations are included, but bringing that to life, that we are an equal opportunity employer. And we mean that for everyone, specifically talking about LGBTQ plus community. We want to make sure there's language in there so that when people are reviewing an opportunity, they can identify and think, at least I want to know more information. And maybe your organization is making voluntary disclosures externally that are often being sought out by candidates. So for example, if you publish a diversity and inclusion report, or if you have an ESG report, those are resources that a lot of candidates are seeking out before even applying for a job now. And especially if they're considering 2 different offers or 2 different positions with 2 different companies, that is something that increasingly surveys indicate is moving the needle and actually making the decision for applicants of not only who appears to be committed, but who is actually committed to EEO, to diversity, to my specific needs based on my identity. And then less obvious maybe is the opposite side of that coin, which I think of as being intentional again as the employer and thinking about the organization, the policies, the practices. For example, as Anthony mentioned, the job descriptions. Is there room for improvement where we can really bring to life the commitment that we have stated, that we are putting out there publicly, but in the way that we operate that, how do we also make this an inclusive and respectful environment from the recruitment process and on?
Those are great points too. And that makes me think of the concept of really attraction. We really, in order to get more representation in our organizations, we need to make sure we as an organization are attractive to all different types and groups of people and identities, right? And so if our branding isn't looking inclusive to the world, then we're going to get more of the same. And so we really want to be able to attract a really wide selection of candidates so we can choose the best, most qualified individuals and still end up with a very diverse group. Those are great points. AJ, do you have anything you want to add to this one?
Yeah, so just 2 other points I'll make. One thing is we always really encourage our clients to think about where they can take unconscious bias out of the application process. So you have a lot of individuals that are acting with best intent, but where those unconscious biases come out into play, things like, I think they would be a good culture carrier. They remind me of myself, right? All of these ways that people are unintentionally excluding candidates who could very well fit the bill. So where you are doing school blind resume reviews, where you are removing grading and really looking at objective strengths and development opportunities when you're going through the application process, looking at applicant pools as a collective and not as individuals come through, right, are ways that you can control it. You can also think about where you can do unconscious training to the individuals who are interviewing. Again, easy online trainings that can be deployed to individuals to think about what are the right types or wrong types of questions that could both either introduce bias into the interview process or unintentionally communicate in a way that leads to an exclusionary feeling for that candidate. So while you may bring someone in who you feel would be a good fit, if that person has an interaction through the interview process where they feel excluded, that's going to impact your ability to drive the applicant pool. And then always easy things that I always recommend to people. It's very easy to start with your preferred pronouns going into an interview, right? You're creating the space for individuals, therefore, to feel like they're included, to offer theirs, to make corrections. So very small tools and tactics that you can do in addition to some of the more systematic changes that you may want to make.
I love those points too. And of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but with respect to training, my thinking is always, we want to set our team members up for success. So we want to set our interviewing managers, our interviewing employees up for success. And not everybody is like us on this call. Not everybody is steeped in knowledge related to unconscious bias, for example. So I believe we need to educate anybody who's involved in this hiring process. They need to know unconscious bias exists. It's a real thing. There's something called affinity bias. There's something called confirmation bias. This is how it might play out. And this is how we owe it to ourselves and our team to interrupt it, and strategies to put in place so that then they can make the best decisions that serve the team and the organization. So all great points from all of you. Thank you for that first kickoff. Before we get into more strategies and solutions, let's kind of do a level set in terms of what are we seeing as some of the biggest challenges that organizations face when they're trying to achieve their DEI goals as it relates to LGBTQ plus and beyond. What are some of the biggest goals that we're seeing? Biggest challenges that we're seeing? Who'd like to start this one?
I'll start that one off. So definitely a big challenge here, and something that Catherine and AJ, you were both just touching on, is taking the time to educate your workforce. And it seems simple, but to do it effectively, you really need to give employees the support and the space. So the resources, whether it's an online training, whether it's an in-person facilitator, but actually carving out that time, because we generally are all so busy, our to-do list is so long, and we're passing from one thing to the other. And you might hear DEI and you think, oh, there's a positive association. And you may hear LGBTQ plus, and you may think, oh, a positive association. But if you're not taking the time to actually unpack your own biases, the potential biases that are out there, different surveys and trends to actually become aware of what might inadvertently be happening in your interpersonal interactions, then there certainly is opportunity. And it also seems simple, but a lot of times, even if people want to be supportive of a certain topic or cause, if they haven't spent the time to research it, have a conversation about it, and it can be intimidating to have conversations when you're outside of your comfort zone. But one indicator is when somebody doesn't even have the vocabulary to express how they feel about a certain topic, then they're in need, whether they know it or not, they are in need of the resources because they have the intention and they have that positive association. So those are really easy areas where people are hungry for this information. You can give it to them and you can really improve that culture.
I love that, right? You want to build the vernacular within the organization, commit to that culture of education, like a growth mindset within our organizations. We can all have a better understanding of all areas, but definitely this one. Those are great points. Thanks, Brittany. AJ, Anthony?
Yeah, one that I would add on to what Brittany had to say, and it's not only creating the vocabulary or language for people to have those conversations, it's also giving people the permission or tools to address when exclusion occurs within groups, within teams, whether at the fault of that individual or they observe exclusion happening on their teams, how to do quick interventions to keep it from becoming larger issues or systemic issues. So, for example, what we hear is a lot of people don't know how to address to a team member when they see maybe a microaggression happen or when they see an exclusionary activity happening. So doing workshops, doing activities where people can practice using the language. We always remind people where you maybe where you make mistake, and look, we're all likely to make a mistake at some point, right? It's acknowledge it, apologize for it, don't dwell on it, right? The more people can practice and simply acknowledge, oh, I'm so sorry, that was not the way I meant to express it, I'll try to work on it going forward. Not ignoring it, which can exacerbate the problem, not profusely apologizing for it, where inadvertently you're making the person feel worse or even more excluded, right? There's that balance there. So where we can help individuals think about how to recognize it, how to practice addressing it in the moment, and then how to improve on it going forward, I think does a huge amount for inclusion in the workplace.
I love that, like getting more granular in terms of what you cover with your team. And, I like to refer to that as a learning journey, because there's so many organizations out there who sort of think, let's do a one and done educational training to bring everybody up to speed. But we all know like one and done doesn't even cover the things that Brittany, you mentioned, and AJ, you mentioned. You really need to have people on your DEI committee or your DEI head committed to this sort of journey of how are we going to bring everybody along? How will we evolve everybody? So those are great points. Anthony, do you have anything you want to add?
I do have a couple to add, and I think it's additive to what Brittany and AJ have already said. So I think going back to a point that Brittany raised around time, there's a natural tension between time and certain DE&I initiatives. So specifically around hiring, I think oftentimes a hiring manager goes into this thinking, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to make, I want a diverse slate. I want all of these things so that I end up with the right outcome. The challenge becomes, I need a bum and seat tomorrow. I need to make a quick decision. And there's this natural tension that happens where oftentimes the DEI candidates may be excluded just because of that time element. So it's making sure both the hiring manager and recruiters are aligned with how do we make sure that ahead of there being a need, there's actually a pipeline identified that meet the various requirements to make sure that it doesn't become a time pressure situation that is exclusive. I think another thing that we haven't addressed in terms of, specifically to the headwinds, and I think building off of what AJ was saying, is this idea of a safe space. Oftentimes, I've heard it recently, and it's a very interesting thing, but you hear, that hetero, cisgender, straight white men are all, an endangered species, so to speak. It's a narrative that plays out in different ways, but what I've found really helpfully counteracts that is just talking about having a safe space. By creating a safe space where people can make mistakes, by actually allowing people to talk through some of these issues where it is an evolving evolutionary learning journey that we are all going on. None of us is perfect. None of us knows it all. And it's something where if we create that safe space and talk about kind of the boundaries in which it is safe, it creates a space where some of those folks who are sometimes the most resistant to DE&I, or sometimes the most resistant to the real positive change we need to be making, actually feel brought on the journey and not excluded themselves. And I think sometimes we don't look at it that way, but it's really important. The last piece that I would add, and this is perhaps somewhat particular to an organization like StanChart, where we are so multinational, we operate in 59 markets, there's a really big headwind right now on what's happening geopolitically. And so if we look at what just happened in Uganda, if we look at what's happened Pakistan, I think it was yesterday or the day before, their high court reversed decisions around trans inclusion. There's a lot of different challenges depending on where you operate. Even looking at just the US, there's over 600 bills pending right now that are anti-LGBTQ+. So keeping that in mind, because it also ties back to how do we engage with our people? How do we make sure to keep our arms around these historically marginalized communities, make sure that they understand that we as an institution are seeing these headwinds, we're navigating them with you, we're here to support you, and making sure that that narrative continues to play out.
Great points. And I think we covered this in this initial question, but the follow-up question is really, are there any other practical steps that organizations can take to ensure workplace inclusion? I know we did cover a number already. Anything else that you can think of, practical steps to ensure this workplace inclusion in addition to what we've mentioned? Anything else? I think we were pretty thorough, but again, the audience.
I'll add one short little thing, is just to incorporate legal review, because the language that is used, especially if it's for the purpose of publication, is so important. It can have such a significance on any individual applicant, and later in terms of studying it after the fact, how did this impact our results? And most of the time, not all the time, but most of that time, you have that positive intention. And so sometimes there can be a lack of criticality in just what is specifically being said, each word, how's it being said, how's it organized, where is it being put out there? And when somebody is, especially legal, because we're used to looking at things this way, but we're making sure that what's actually being put out there aligns with the intention. And so I like to recommend that, even if you can incorporate legal earlier on in the process to make sure we're going down the right path, I think it makes for a better result at the end.
Yeah, I'll echo those statements 100%. I've been brought in before when somebody has tried to do a makeshift DEI training program, but they haven't incorporated the legal advice you're referring to ahead of time. And so the best of intentions were there, the goals were there, but the execution really exposed the organization to legal liability instead of just getting it closer to the accomplishment of its goals. So you really need to make sure when you embrace DEI concepts, you have the goals in mind, DEI perspective, HR perspective, and then legal. So completely agree with you there, Brittany. AJ mentioned earlier microaggressions, right? Making sure everybody understands what microaggressions are. So let's talk about that for a minute. What are some effective strategies for combating microaggressions? So we talked about educating people as to their existence, but how how do we build that new muscle memory that AJ was referring to into the organization and grow the organizational culture in a positive way away from microaggressions? Any thoughts there?
Two thoughts from my end. One, I think a lot of times it's sharing vocabulary. Again, it comes back to language. People may not even realize certain language that is in modern vernacular can be perceived as a microaggression. So simply just calling that out, explaining it, letting people know, hey, here are phrases that to different groups can sound exclusionary or can be trigger phrases. I think that's one important way to do it. Two, I think it's in using privilege, right? So in groups where maybe it's very much in group, people are using language or behaviors, taking that opportunity to challenge people on words they're using, things that could be perceived as microaggressions if you had, say, a queer or trans person in that room, right, where you can intervene on behalf of that. And one other thing that we often talk about that we think is really important as well is microaggressions can often be addressed very quickly when there are existing interpersonal relationships within the team. So it is actually really important to invest in team building, invest in those relationships early on, especially in our experience at Bain, where we do have team dynamics shifting on a fairly regular basis, that when you can build those relationships, when you can establish trust within those relationships early on, if and when microaggressions occur, they're not viewed as necessarily malintent, and people can move on from it a lot quicker. So those are some important characteristics that we try to encourage in our teams early on in the development process.
Great points. Thanks, AJ.
I think adding on AJ's points there. Oh, sorry, jumping in. Sorry, Brittany.
Yeah.
Adding on AJ's points, I think, again, looking at this from just a language and vernacular perspective, we also struggle a lot with just the multicultural dimension. There's different values and cultural norms across different cultures, and understanding how do you navigate that. That's why having a really good team dynamic, as AJ says, is really, really important, making sure that people understand how to approach those. I also think an added component that we've all struggled with is the virtual. And I think we've seen an increase in rhetoric and a comfort of sitting behind a screen and being able to lob a bit of a grenade at people without recognizing how harmful that could be impacting. So we often talked about, the impact versus intent. Your intent may have been completely positive, but it's being able to accept that how that impacted somebody else is different than your intent, and go with that impact versus your own intent to understand how do you correct that behavior.
Great point. Thanks, Anthony. Brittany?
Yeah, just a few quick points. I agree completely with what's already been shared. I think in terms of just from the legal perspective, sometimes I'm dealing with an issue that has come up or a complaint. And so sort of thinking about it from the opposite direction. We think of DEI as aspirational, and sometimes it can be difficult to address a negative situation with your aspirational commitment. And that's where we can rely on other policies like our EEO or respect in the workplace policies, where there may be some tensions. And so you're not sure as the employer exactly if you should say something versus something else. And as a check or even to help guide that conversation, I'm usually advising people to look at their other existing policies, whether it's their code of conduct or their respect in the workplace standards, where regardless of how anyone identifies, what anyone's beliefs are, this is the line that is respect in the workplace, and that is what we are committed to. And so you can also coach from that direction and hopefully reach everyone because it's coming from a neutral place. Another thought that came to mind was, and just building on our conversations already about education and empowering people to actually address those situations, taking it a step further would be inclusive leadership, is what I refer to it as, where those in management positions are instructed and trained that not only do they have an obligation to act a certain way because of their position within the organization, but this also is a way to demonstrate how you expect everyone else to respond as well. So being able to effectively address microaggressions, especially in a group setting, do it in a respectful way, do it in a productive way, where the team is actually becoming closer afterwards as opposed to becoming divided. That is a way to build on the teams, like AJ was saying, to have your policies and trainings come to life through the people that they respect in daily interactions.
Yeah, I love that. And just one last point, tying in with the fact that the stronger cultures, the stronger relationships have, either fewer microaggressions that are, communicated, or people are more comfortable raising them with each other. I think another last strategy to combat microaggressions is really building that culture and creating a culture of micro affirmations, because micro affirmations leave little room for microaggressions, and they are specific things that can be said or done to build that trust that AJ was referring to, and grow those relationships that are being referred to, so that again, we have more of the positive and less of the negative. So all great points. Thank you again. Now moving more towards sort of a multinational perspective, because I know there are many multinational organizations represented on this call. How do we think multinational organizations can most effectively champion this culture of inclusiveness we're talking about as it relates to LGBTQ plus in different regions across, whether it's across the United States or across the world, in the UK and the US and beyond? Any thoughts there?
All right, I'm happy to jump in. I've talked a lot about multinational. So I think one of the big things here, there's different approaches to this, right? There's the when in Rome model, there's the embassy model, there's the advocacy model. I think if we think about consistency, is some of the things that I try to hold Stand Chart and any organization I would work for to account, making sure that at a minimum we are consistent in the tone, the message, and how we approach these issues, and in a very thoughtful and intentional way. I will say overtly, we operate in markets that are a huge challenge. We operate in Qatar, we operate in Bahrain, we operate in Saudi, we operate in Egypt, in Brunei. So we have a very challenged footprint with markets where LGBTQI plus inclusion is just simply not possible writ large. But what do? Well, our code of conduct, our EEO policies, our standards for respect in the workplace, which includes globalized training, still covers LGBTQIA plus, irrespective of local law and challenges. It's not easy, is the answer. It's not easy to always be the best at this, but it is keeping that consistency, making sure that the messaging, especially from the group, from Central in London or wherever your headquarters may be, keeping that tone and consistency is really, really important. And then honestly, being a little bit unafraid to push boundaries in some of the markets where it is the most challenging, whether that's here across different state lines or if that's internationally as well, being able to really test where can we be an advocate, where can we lead, whether it's governmental interactions, whether it's on the ground NGO support, where can we be a force for good in the world where this demographic may otherwise be marginalized still? How can we continue to push that and make sure that we're delivering against that value promise?
Great points. Brittany, AJ, anything to add there?
I think those were fantastic points. I will just underline what Anthony already said in terms of being intentional and taking the time to actually know what the legal limitations are, what the cultural implications are, so then you can execute in a way that's meaningful and genuine.
Absolutely.
The only thing I would add there is the policies you can put in place across geographies, right? And then there's the support you can provide in market, because even if that individual is supported within the four walls of our offices, they then need to go live in environments where their lifestyle may not be supported, right? And so where you can offer mental health support, where if critical, you can explore office transfers or role transfers, right? To really try to demonstrate and support those individuals where needed, I think is an important lever that everyone can think about pulling as well.
Great, thanks. So we're running out of time. We have a few minutes left. So why don't we shift to one particular segment of LGBTQ plus, and let's talk about transgender employees for a moment. What are some of the things that organizations can do to really provide the necessary infrastructure, policies, et cetera, to support their trans employees? Any ideas you'd like to share? Anthony, you want to start again?
Sure, happy to. So StanChart has been quite intentional in how we built out toolkits around trans inclusion. So these are designed specifically for people leaders, in addition to colleagues who may be, supporting or frankly dealing with somebody having recently come out as transgendered. It really creates a sense of what our organizational values are, what healthcare and other benefits may be available to a transgendered individual, but also setting a very clear tone of expectation from the organization to all people. This is how we're going to deal with this and support this colleague and make sure that they are fully embraced within the organization and supported through the various aspects of their journey and their process in the bank. In addition to that, I think there's a little bit of how do we make sure to, again, support this more broadly outside of just our four walls as an organization. I think AJ rightly says, there's the four walls that we can protect people inside of, but outside of that, there's a very realistic, sometimes existential challenge that folks will face. Making sure that there's a holistic set of support networks in place. How do we make sure that happens? There's a lot of different ways. Some of that could be very intentionally institutional. Some of those could also just be informal. How do we create a network of colleagues who have been through similar journeys, whether locally or globally, and act as a support network for one another, creating a network of mental health first aiders so that people have that port of call if they're struggling. I think there's a whole host of things that we could do to be more inclusive there.
That's great. And you're right, policies not only like set the standard, but they also help educate those who are not educated. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen it in all of our organizations. There's a spectrum of people, from those who are highly, highly evolved in their understanding of, every DEI issue, and those who are not as evolved. And so by communicating the policies ahead of time, you can save yourself the trouble of dealing with disputes and misunderstandings that arise because people don't understand, what the expectations are. So those are some great points. Brittany, do you have anything you want to add to that? Speaking of policies,
I will, but I saw AJ was about to jump in.
Oh,
so
AJ, then jump in. You're so kind.
Yeah, one thing, this was something that we have really worked on over the past 2 years with it being, I was shocked to learn the number of systems and infrastructure issues that a trans or non-binary person runs into on a daily or weekly basis that confronts the binary. So I would encourage you all to just spend a week thinking through how many HRIS systems only allow for 2 genders or require approval to change genders. How does that tie into third-party systems? What locker rooms are available, bathrooms are available, right? There's a lot of things that we take for granted, at least for me as a cis-identifying individual, that can really impact the visibility of inclusion within your organization for trans individuals, but to just the experience of trans individuals in environments where companies have started putting in policies to provide that support. So it's sort of that added layer that I think goes beyond what policies you can put in place, just what is the infrastructure that we're working in, and where do we need to think about making changes and adjustments to that.
Great. Almost do an audit. Like
Exactly.
Have somebody really go through with a critical eye. That's a great point. Thanks, AJ. Brittany?
Yeah, so I agree completely. I really like the points about the policies, deciding in advance what the company position is going to be. So then your leaders have a resource, they know, and they have direction. Also with the infrastructure that AJ was mentioning, I agree completely. And I want to make sure that I comment on the reality of how issues are arising in the workplace right now when you have those policies and when you have the infrastructure. And it can be very tricky. And I regularly get questions from clients asking, I've gotten a complaint because of our commitment in the interest of our transgender employees. And a lot of times the complaint is couched in religion or politics. And so, to be completely honest, that is a very tricky situation because you have legally protected interests on both sides. And so first, just recommending legal advice in the process because it can be tricky. And even if you look at your respect in the workplace policies and you know how you want to respond, it's the words that are chosen, it's the specific language, it's the way the message is delivered, because there are competing legally protected interests. So you want to make sure that you're staying consistent with what you've already developed, with what you've already put in place. You're sending that message across the organization. Likely you have to at least anticipate that. What is our stance and how do we make sure that we're doing this in a way that is minimizing exposure of legal risk while staying consistent with our commitments to our employees?
Great. Well, thank you all for your really, really helpful and insightful commentary. I know the audience appreciates it all. I'd love to open it up for our last 5 minutes if there are any questions from the audience. And then once we address those questions, or if there are none, I'd love to hear any of your final thoughts and takeaways for the audience. So I am looking at the, let's see, chat feature. I don't see any chats yet. Raise your hand. Would anybody like to raise their hand and ask a question of my highly esteemed panelists and colleagues?
Catherine, there were a few themes that I thought were really interesting that I just was hoping the panelists might dive a little deeper into.
Absolutely.
I'll just throw them all out and then everyone.
Perfect.
I think so. One, and I think Anthony, maybe this came from you, but you mentioned sort of the nature of these virtual meetings and events kind of allowing for some bad behavior or allowing people to hide behind that virtual setting. And so I was wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit more about that. Catherine, I think it was you that mentioned the micro affirmations as sort of a counter to the microaggression.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit more about that. And then I don't know if there's more to say on it, but just AJ's point around the sort of systems that have inherent bias for transgender people and what we as organizations can do to counteract that. So those were my 3 that kind of stuck out and I'd like to hear a little bit more about.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Anthony, do you want to go first?
I'll jump right into the virtual. So I think we've all seen as, the pandemic came about and we've all shifted to this kind of virtual hybrid environment. And I think many of us were operating in that before, but it's become much more amplified with everybody being forced to do that. While there's an equalizer of us all sitting within an equal-sized box, so to speak, the challenge becomes with how we interact. And I think there's been an increase in rhetoric, just holistically. There's a divisiveness in our politics. And irrespective of where you may sit across those divides, it's created an amplified sense of I can tell you how I really feel and no holds barred. And unfortunately, especially when it comes to historically marginalized communities, you see this amplification of things that go from microaggression to just pure out aggression. And I think what we need to be mindful of, and I think both AJ and Brittany have said this already, just being extra mindful of recognizing it, calling it out, and creating a culture where it's okay to say, actually, that wasn't appropriate behavior, and please, walk that back a bit. But I think we just need to be extra mindful in a virtual world because it's easy to sit behind a screen and think that that doesn't directly impact. We don't see it. Oftentimes, there's a number of people here on this call who don't have their cameras on. We can't necessarily see how they've received what we've said. So it's just being extra mindful, extra cautious, and creating a space where people can call it out and note the bad behaviors, and also to the micro affirmations or validations, really creating a culture around the positive side of it and not just the negative.
Great, that's great. To your question about the micro affirmations, I view micro affirmations really as a free corporate benefit, right? And so I always advocate to HR teams and leaders to really think about, let's look at our department and do we have a culture of engaging in micro affirmations, and what kind of micro affirmations are we currently using to make our team members feel included, and supported and important and understood. And it's, I always like to say it's not rocket science, right? It's more along the lines of EQ than IQ, but it's asking team members how they're doing. It's praising them in public. It's repeating something they said and acknowledging that they said it and it sounds like a good idea. So I've seen lots of groups kind of break out amongst themselves and talk about what are the micro affirmations we're currently using to support our team members and what could we be doing and saying more of to create this culture of acceptance, understanding, support, inclusion. So just some ideas there. And then AJ, do you want to address the last one?
Yeah, I think, there's the audit is a great way to put it, where you can be proactive in identifying those systems that can change, right? But also identifying those systems that can't. So for example, travel booking, right? To travel in the United States, it requires single gender identity, right? And so the ability to flow from HRIS systems where it may permit non-binary genders into travel bookings, you often run into areas of conflict there. So being clear, being upfront, helping to address around those areas where you can, and communicating in advance if someone comes forward to you identifying as trans, non-binary, right? As you're onboarding them, knowing which systems could be those challenges and addressing it proactively. So there is both knowing the things that you can fix and then knowing the things that for many reasons right now you can't, but being proactive about those.
They're great points. I feel like I could be on this panel for hours because you all have such rich and broad input and insights, and I'm sure the audience feels the same way. So just to end, can each of you share either what's your opinion in terms of what does a fully inclusive workplace of the future look like, or if you have any other closing thoughts that you've been thinking about that you'd like to share. So either what does that fully inclusive workplace look like, or any other closing thoughts that you think you'd like to leave the audience with. Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I love the way you framed that question, Catherine, because I have a pin. I should have worn it today, but it says the future is inclusive. So I think about that all the time. And what is it that we can do? And if just a high level takeaway would be intentionality. I think you heard it from every single person here, is taking the time to really understand what is involved in any decision point. And you may be surprised in how much opportunity can be in the smallest of it, whether it's specific to recruitment or just everyday life within the organization. And then from the legal perspective, I would say again, it's intentional, but it's the application of intentionality to this legal perspective, which is understanding the risks and knowingly undertaking them for a specific purpose. There's risk in absolutely every business decision. So I'm not saying that there's risk that's specific to this that you wouldn't find anywhere else, but just intentionally undertaking it so that you're prepared, you're building in protections, which may include additional trainings, formalized processes, whatever it is, you're taking the steps because you're already anticipating that there may be some pushback from some source. And we want to make sure that we are genuinely committed to this inclusiveness, especially for our LGBTQ plus community. And so we are making these commitments that involves this amount of budget and this amount of staff. Because if you expect changes to occur without those resources, that's really a recipe for disaster.
Great points. Thanks, Brittany.
I'll just echo Brittany's points there about intentionality and commitment. I think I view, inclusion as a journey. It's not a destination. We will always continue to evolve and learn more. In our multiple millennia on this planet as human beings, we've learned more about ourselves and the world around us as we've evolved. I think it's going to be a long-term journey, but that inclusive workplace, what does it look like? What does it feel like? It's a place where everybody inherently belongs. And I think there's some simple things that we can do that really create that. So I obviously work in a workplace and a corporate real estate team. How you design a place matters. How you think about artwork, simple decisions on color tone, lighting, it creates an environment where everybody has a space and a place, and making sure that you build in that placemaking strategy intentionally and put the commitment behind making sure that it's equally representative across the board.
Thanks, Anthony. And AJ?
Yeah, for me, it's where all people of an organization respect, understand, and appreciate the labels that an individual places on themselves, but then the ability to move past those and understand the person underneath, right? I think, again, we've talked about it a lot. Language is very important. Language I use to identify myself is very important to me and how I present to the world. So you understanding what that means and how to interact with it is important, but also moving beyond those labels and being able to interact with AJ the person is the most important part.
Love that too. For me, I think, and I think this is tied into what everybody said, but it's really having organizations that embrace a growth mindset, especially as it relates to DEI, because from my perspective, especially as it relates to Gen Z, this upcoming generation, they want DEI, they expect it, they demand it, and they will leave your organization if they don't see it and feel it. And so for the future of the health of our society as well as our organizations, we really need to have a growth mindset. And as Maya Angelou says, and I love this quote, we're all doing the best we can until we know better. And then once we know better, we need to do better. And that's what I'm hoping we see in all of our organizations as it relates to inclusion in the workplace. So with that, I just want to thank this amazing panel. Thank the audience for staying with us and learning from us. And Tamara, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, well, just another quick thank you from me to you, Catherine, for leading us through this conversation. It was fantastic. AJ, Anthony, Brittany, really appreciate your time. As I said, this is an ongoing series for British American business. So please, stay in touch, keep tabs on what we're doing, because we want to continue having these conversations, and we couldn't do it without all of you, our speakers and our audience. So thank you all so much, and have a good summer if I don't see you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.